A book that won our 2008 Eldridge Prize Award. Her current project is tentatively entitled Asian Objects, Visual Culture, Imperial Relations, and the Pacific World.
In 1898, the United States went to war with Spain in Spain's last remaining colonies in the Caribbean and the Pacific, in a war that began as the Spanish-American War, but later slid into what is sometimes called the Spanish-American-Cuban-Filipino War, as the United States found itself in conflict with the independence movements with which it was ostensibly allied. It has long been assumed that, in this war, an intimate relationship existed between images and military conflict. As the communications historian Joseph Campbell emphasizes, quote, "One of the most famous stories in American journalism," end quote, is the 1897 exchange between the American artist Frederick Remington and the newspaper publisher William Randolph Hearst. Remington, then in Havana at Hearst's behest, had found that, quote, "everything is quiet," and thus had asked to leave the city. The publisher's reply, which Campbell believes Hearst never actually sent, was, quote, "Please remain. You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war," end quote. Thus, in Campbell's view, even Hearst's unsent telegram provides, quote, "compelling evidence about how the Yellow Press, led by Hearst's New York Journal, forced the United States into war with Spain in 1898, end quote. Beyond arguments by historians or historians of journalism proposing a causal or catalytic role for images in, quote, "forcing war," moreover, film scholars have promoted a different but also widely shared view, joining visual culture and geopolitical relations in this case. That is that the war played a significant and perhaps even a determining part in the germination of a commercial motion picture industry whose persistence and success in the United States was at the time far from guaranteed. Just as images sold war, in other words, in this second line of argument, war sold images to enthusiastic audiences looking for spectacle and excitement. This, indeed, is one of the interpretations offered by the explanatory essay that accompanies the Library of Congress's online presentation of its extensive collection of American films from the conflict, which emphasizes that, quote, "the Spanish-American War increased the movie's popularity since films of the war sparked great interest and patriotism in theatergoers. Sensationalist stories of Spanish atrocities abounded in the newspapers and encouraged motion picture producers to take advantage of a potentially lucrative situation," end quote. Yet despite all the attention that has been given to the relationship between aesthetic and geopolitical processes in the Spanish-American War, surprisingly little effort has been devoted specifically to analyzing that relationship from the vantage point of today's proceedings, that is, the relationship between the United States and Asia. Indeed, while, quote, "famous stories" abound from the conflict in Cuba, very little has been written about the place of visual culture in the as long, equally tumultuous relationship between the United States and the Philippines that began with this conflict. Moreover, because so much emphasis has been placed on questions of causality, scholars seem to have become wedded to an abbreviated, overly tidy chronology that ends abruptly with the official cessation of hostilities. The Spanish-American War in motion pictures, for example, ends its Cuba material with the Treaty of Paris, and its Philippine section with Theodore Roosevelt's proclamation of the end of hostilities on the 4th of July, 1902. To a certain degree, this frame might make sense for Cuba, where a relatively clear line may be drawn at war's end, and where the United States instantiated various measures of indirect semi-colonial rule rather than a direct colonial regime. This chronology is much more problematic, however, for the Philippines, where neither the American prosecution of empire nor the constitutive use of images within it ended with the peace. Indeed, in the Philippines, where, as the Spanish-American War in motion pictures rather laconically notes, quote, "guerrilla resistance continued," end quote, the peace didn't even bring peace. Rather, it brought a protracted period of American occupation, supported and sustained through the creation and manipulation of a visual culture distinctly suited to that occupation. Visual culture, in short, worked not only to foment war fever, but also to create authority and legitimacy for the United States over the long term. Now, I don't want to squander all of my time today criticizing previous work, but I do want to touch briefly upon another final set of two limitations that I believe must be overcome if we are to understand the long and tumultuous interaction between the United States and the Philippines, or for that matter, if we are adequately to approach the more general question of how processes related to visual culture intersect with political and military practices in the fashioning of geopolitical relations. That is to say that, in this case, scholars have also chosen an unnecessarily narrow range both of aesthetic practices and works upon which to base their analysis. Turning first to practices, it can be seen that scholars have focused, as I have suggested, on only certain constellations of processes, chiefly the creation of images for commercial markets and the creation of obviously political images to sell or criticize war. But if we scratch a little below the surface, we see that a much more complex array of practices, often duly charged with aesthetic and political significance, attended the US-Philippine relationship, including architectural destruction and the iconoclastic pulling down of Catholic statuary by American forces. That's the first image here. The looting of smaller objects and the removal of those objects, in some cases, to the United States. Indeed, I should emphasize that this practice was sufficiently widespread that the Archbishop of Manila published and presented to the United States a catalog of claims for damages in hope of obtaining reparations, and the alteration of the meaning of buildings and objects through recontextualization and other processes. We also see various kinds of memorialization, defined concisely by the archaeologist Adam T. Smith as the use of aesthetic forms to, quote, cue memories of specific events that define a polity's role within the macro-political order, end quote. This can be seen most obviously in the creation of fixed three-dimensional monuments, such as San Francisco's Dewey Monument, which commemorated the admiral's victory over the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay. But it can also be seen in the reiteration, reproduction, and circulation of such works, and the civic rituals for which they became focal points in works such as the American Mutoscope and Biograph Company's 1903 Panorama Union Square, San Francisco, of the crowd gathering for Roosevelt's dedication of the Dewey Monument itself. And as an aside, I should note that this film is not filed under the Spanish-American War in Motion Pictures, but rather in the Library of Congress's generic early motion pictures section. And finally, for now, although this certainly does not exhaust all of the practices of instrumental aesthetics that could be identified in this case, we see American efforts, most obviously in the case of the Philippine Commission's flag law of 1907, which, quote, forbade the Filipinos to use or display the Philippine flag anywhere, even inside Philippine homes, end quote. The enactment of official policies designed to limit and control the visual environments. And I would add as an aside here, and I'm aware of making asides because I know they take up a lot of time, that one other element of this is the attempt to reproduce the American art education system in the school in the Philippines, which is something that I just started to work on and I'd be interested in talking about that possibly. Studies to date have, moreover, tended to focus on certain kinds of works, particularly moving and still photography, but also engraved cartoons. The historian Kristen Hoganson's influential Fighting for American Manhood, How Gender Politics Provoked the Spanish-American and Philippine-American Wars, for example, is perhaps typical in including, alongside transcripts of congressional debates, the papers of political figures, and other conventional textual historical sources, a long series of political cartoons that appeared in the American press in the build-up to and during the conflict. But, with a very few exceptions, such as design historian David Brody's work on aspects of American architecture in the Philippines, scholars have paid virtually no attention to many other of the truly vast array of works that were made by Americans across an exceptionally comprehensive spectrum of media and dimensions, or for that matter, to the overall significance of this creation of an interactive, synthetic complex of works. Now, obviously, it would be impossible to present the totality of such works in such a brief forum, but for the rest of my time today, I'd like to offer a brief glimpse of a few examples across the range, beginning with two-dimensional images and moving ultimately towards landscapes, and to make some observations along the way. Once again, the sheer volume of material and the notable paucity of synthetic analysis requires me at this point to cast these observations as ideas for the direction that research might take rather than conclusions. Now, I'd like to start my tour today with one of the most widely made and disseminated kinds of American works produced in this context, picture postcards. Typical examples, which like stereographs were produced by commercial outfits such as Deniston's, or in this case, the Manila Postcard Company, include this postcard of Fort Santiago, or this image of Felix Rojas's 19th century Dominican church, built after the 1863 earthquake upon the site of a succession of Dominican churches dating to the 16th century and subsequently destroyed in the Second World War. Besides their commercial manufacture, these images are also typical in other respects. The first is their subject, in that they both represent well-known architectural landmarks, in both cases in Manila's walled city, Intramuros. In the first instance, the building is the 16th century Spanish fort, itself built upon a pre-Hispanic cuta, or stronghold, upon which the United States Army built its headquarters. And in the second, it is one of the 7 churches of the Catholic religious orders that, together with the cathedral, had made Intramuros the sacred as well as the military and civic locus of the Spanish colonial Philippines. Whoops. Not sure what that's doing there. They're also typical of many American postcards of the occupied Philippines in terms of their style, particularly the post-chromolithographic color and apparent photorealism. And it could be said that they are also typical in the way that they have been archived. Both are in the National Anthropological Archives, rather than, for example, American History, or SAM, which I expect explains the oddly distancing titles the images have acquired: View of Wood Fort on Masonry Parapet, Entrance Bridge, and American Flag for the first, and Large Masonry and Stucco Gothic-style Church for the second. This archive, it should be noted, is also home to a set of picture postcards from another former Spanish territory, California, with which the Philippine postcards share a common style, a common origin as commercial objects, and a common resting place, not only in the National Anthropological Archives, but also within the 3-dimensional object to which I will turn next. This object, now in the National Library of the Philippines, is a 2-volume album of images that were created or collected, annotated, and anthologized by 2 Americans in the Philippines in the early 20th century, Luther and Maud Neal Parker. The Parkers were members of the so-called Thomasites, a group of about 500 teachers sent in 1901 to the Philippines aboard the USS Thomas to teach, to train Filipino teachers, and to replace Spanish with English as the medium of school instruction. I have not uncovered much about the biography of Maud Parker, but certain details of Luther Parker's life have been preserved. Although born in Missouri, he was raised and educated in California, where he and Maud Parker returned following their time in the Philippines. Before going to the Philippines, moreover, Luther Parker apparently taught in an Indian school in Oregon. The Parker album is worth mentioning, if only because of how, with its inclusion of ethnographic images, it appears to intersect with albums made during other moments of interaction between expanding empires and new subjects, including in Asia. One parallel that might be noted, for example, are the ethnographic Miao albums analyzed by Laura Hostetler in her Qing Colonial Enterprise, Ethnography, and Cartography in Early Modern China. As Hostetler suggests, the making of such images and albums directly connected to imperial rule in at least 2 respects. First, by providing officials with information about ethnically different subjects, and second, by representing those subjects as part of the imperial whole. But, fruitful as the pursuit of such a parallel might be, what is more striking to me is the fact that the Parkers seem to have pursued ethnography only as a sideline. Instead, the subject that seems chiefly to have drawn their attention as the makers, collectors, annotators, and contextualizers of images was architecture. Indeed, the album is crammed full of pictures of buildings, including both the Parkers' own freshly taken photographs of both pre-US and US-built structures, especially schools, and ready-made images, including photographs sent to the Parkers by fellow Americans, and commercially manufactured postcards, including, as I've indicated, 19 images of the California missions. This inclusion is curious enough in an album otherwise devoted to the Philippines that I would like to speculate on why the Parkers would have put them in. One way of thinking about this question is to think about the kinds of geopolitical problems that the pursuit of aesthetic processes might have been intended to address in this instance. For Americans in the Philippines, one pressing issue, discussed, for example, in Paul Kramer's historical work on the US occupation, was the matter of how the United States was to establish a stable geopolitical relationship across discontiguous territory. One response, perhaps, was for Americans to imagine the Philippines in terms of other places that had once been culturally and geographically separate from the United States, but that had been incorporated into it. To imagine the Philippines, in other words, as a new California or a new New Mexico. This, perhaps, explains the Parkers' joint placement of the postcards of the California missions alongside images of picturesquely decrepit, sometimes obligingly ruined Philippine churches in an album that also extensively chronicled the American creation of new buildings and landscapes. And yet, unlike California, whose scattered missions were easily neutralized by being made into postcards, the much denser and thus more intractable Philippine landscape did not so easily lend itself to reimagination. Thus, Americans turned to more complex and more thoroughgoing processes of appropriation and Americanization, both at the level of the actual physical transformation of buildings and landscapes, but also in terms of the representation of buildings and landscapes thus transformed. We've already seen something of this sort in the postcard of the US Army headquarters built upon Fort Santiago, which presented the contemporary Americanized fort with its flag as a fait accompli. But perhaps more interestingly, in the Parker album, we can see this process slowed down to freeze frame. Consider, for example, the treatment of Manila's Jesuit Observatory in the Parker album, a building that, like the Dominican Church, was destroyed in the Second World War. Generally speaking, it can be said that observatories are special sorts of buildings with special scientific and cultural significance, even to the extent that they were specifically recognized as deserving of protection in Francis Lieber's 1863 General Orders No. 100, or Lieber's Code, the landmark American document that subsequently formed the basis for international conventions on the laws of war. Moreover, it could be argued that Jesuit observatories in particular embodied some of the better aspects of the history of early modern interaction between Catholic Europe and Asia. None of this, of course, is apparent from the Parker album, except indirectly by virtue of the fact that the photograph of the building in the album is a commercial photograph with a bilingual English-Spanish caption. Rather, what dominates the page in the Parker album are Maud Parker's annotations from 1901, inscribing the numbers 1 through 5 upon the photograph, renaming the building as the, quote, exposition building where we are stationed, end quote, indicating the baggage room, assembly hall, observatory, ladies' quarters, and carriage rooms, end quote, and marking out precisely where the Parkers lived. Thus, it was Parker's pen on the photo and the Parkers' physical presence in the building, as much as the orders of an American official, as much as the orders of an American official that transformed the observatory from scientific monument to American barracks. This brings us more directly to our final stop today, American buildings and landscapes created as an aspect of the US-Philippine relationship. The best-known example here is the only partially realized plan to reconfigure the entire city of Manila, initially devised by Daniel Burnham, but undertaken by a multitude of American and Filipino architects. This plan involved the establishment of grand avenues, notably Dewey, now Rojas Avenue, along Manila Bay, and the construction of large new neoclassical civic buildings, like the former legislative and finance buildings, Now, the art and anthropology galleries of the National Museum of the Philippines, and this is the first one, the art gallery, and this is the other one, the anthropology gallery. And you can see in Washington, you can see where I'm going with the similarities here. It's sort of uncanny, actually. These buildings directly referenced both the American metropole and the more general process of reiteration that attended to the imperial building projects of Britain and other European empires. And even in its partially realized form, this reconfiguration had an important effect, that is to say, deconsecrating Intramuros, which had been the physical center of Spanish civic and religious authority in the Philippines since the 16th century, and relocating that power to nearby but extramural parts of the city. As such, it deserves much more attention than I can give it today, so I can give a plug for my talk at CAA if you want to find out more about the architecture in February. However, following the above, what I want to emphasize today is that the grand avenues and imposing buildings of American-occupied Manila were only the most obvious example of an American program of geographical reformulation that was at once more thoroughgoing and more quotidian. This can be seen if we look at a landscape like the golf course that was built adjacent to the walls of Intramuros subsequent to Burnham's decision on sanitary grounds to fill the moat. Or if we turn back to the Parker album for a moment and consider buildings like the schools and hospitals they cataloged. Consider, for example, this photograph of a US-built hospital. Notable here are not only the style in which the hospital is built, it looks like nothing so much as a California craftsman bungalow, but also the annotation pasted into the album. This typed paper note, either copied after or clipped directly from a letter to Maud Parker, stated that the, quote, hospital is entirely free from the usual odors of such institutions. All of this is the great monument of the American flag in the Philippine Islands, end quote. This, I think, is very interesting because it raises a question that has, I think, been secondary to analyses like the kind I mentioned before that have focused on, for example, ethnographic representations of the colonized. And that is the relationship in the Philippines between the creation and reformulation of civic institutions along American lines and the physical creation or reformulation of those institutions as buildings and landscapes. Now, I realize that I'm running out of time, but I want very briefly to give a final example of another quotidian form that Americans built in the Philippines. Gazebos, which I think is an especially felicitous example with which to end insofar as gazebos were themselves an Anglo-American appropriation of an Asian form, as would have been known by American collectors like Charles Lang Freer, from images like this 13th century painting, Lakeside Gazebo with Palace Ladies. Although this image calls to mind elite social rituals or quiet contemplation in the context of the 19th and early 20th century United States, I think it is fair to say that the gazebo on the public green acquired quite a different set of associations. Particularly when configured as a bandstand, the American gazebo is situated precisely at the confluence of landscape architecture and civic ritual, and is perhaps quintessentially associated with the performance of Americanness. Thus, it is not surprising that gazebos were built in places like the Carlisle Indian School, as well as the Philippines, whose incredibly American-looking gazebo landscapes were then reiterated in 2 dimensions. Indeed, in looking at this image, one could really and truly be looking at California, at perhaps the San Gabriel Mountains on the 4th of July, as the band prepares for the parade and fireworks. Now, I would say, don't get ready to start cooking yet, because, of course, it's not actually a postcard of the San Gabriel Mountains, it's a postcard of the Iwahig Penal Colony on Palawan Island, built by the United States in 1904. And the band is actually a band of prisoners, or colonists, as they are described in the title. But that, I suppose, just emphasizes what I've been saying all along, that visual cultural forms and practices played constitutive roles in the US-Philippine relationship, particularly as the United States made the transition from military conqueror to colonial ruler.